Have you ever wondered what it feels like to lie perfectly still while vultures circle overhead, knowing that even the slightest breath could mean your death? Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And please, subscribe to this channel. We need your support to keep bringing these hidden stories to light. Stories the history books don't want you to know. The official military records from the Indian Wars describe the incident as a routine patrol gone wrong. But those who know the truth understand that what happened on that September afternoon in 1873 was something far more disturbing, something that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives, something that military historians still debate in hushed conversations, away from public ears. Fort Richardson, Texas, September 19th, 1873. The morning began like any other at the remote military outpost situated on the edge of Comanche territory. Captain Marcus Welland assembled his patrol unit of 23 men just after dawn. Their mission was straightforward: scout the northern perimeter along Lost Creek, check for signs of hostile movement, and return before nightfall. Standard procedure for cavalry units stationed in the disputed territories of North Texas. Among the soldiers was Private First Class Jonathan Thaddeus Mercer, 26 years old, originally from a small farm outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Mercer had enlisted 3 years prior, seeking adventure and escape from the failing family homestead. His service record showed nothing remarkable: average marksmanship scores, satisfactory performance in drills, 2 minor disciplinary infractions for tardiness. He was, by all accounts, an unremarkable soldier in an unremarkable posting. But Jonathan Mercer possessed something that couldn't be measured in military evaluations, a quality that frontier veterans recognized but never spoke about openly: the ability to become invisible. Not literally, of course, but in the way that certain men could blend into terrain, control their breathing to near imperceptibility, and remain motionless for hours while their minds stayed sharp and alert. His fellow soldiers had noticed it during hunting expeditions. How Mercer could sit in the brush for an entire afternoon without fidgeting, without coughing, barely seeming to breathe at all. He would need every ounce of that ability before the sun set that day. The patrol moved out at 6:15 in the morning, riding in a loose column formation through the scrub oak and mesquite that dominated the landscape. The September heat was already building, promising temperatures above 100 degrees by midday. Lieutenant Charles Hammond rode at the front, occasionally consulting a hand-drawn map that was more guess than geography. The land this far from established settlements remained largely unmapped, known only through tribal memory and the dangerous experience of soldiers who ventured too far from their forts. They reached Lost Creek by 10:30. The stream bed was nearly dry, just a trickle of brackish water cutting through red clay banks. Hammond ordered a brief rest. The horses needed water. The men needed shade. In his official report, Hammond would later write that he detected nothing unusual during this stop. No signs of observation, no indication they were being watched. But they were. The Kiowa scouts had spotted the patrol 3 miles before it reached the creek. There were 9 of them, led by a war chief the soldiers would never have recognized. The Kiowa had learned, through brutal experience, that direct confrontation with cavalry units often ended poorly. The soldiers had repeating rifles, superior numbers, and the cruel mathematics of sustained firepower. But the Kiowa had something else: patience, knowledge of terrain, and an intimate understanding of human psychology under extreme stress. They didn't attack at the creek. They waited. The patrol resumed its route at 11:45, following the creek bed northward into increasingly broken terrain. The landscape shifted from open scrubland to rocky outcroppings and shallow ravines. Visibility decreased. The perfect conditions for an ambush, which is why Lieutenant Hammond kept his men alert, rifles ready, moving in a tighter formation than before. The first shot came at 12:17. Private Daniel Kowalski, riding fourth from the front, jerked violently in his saddle as a rifle round struck him in the upper chest. He tumbled backward off his horse, dead before he hit the ground. The shot had come from a rocky outcropping approximately 300 yards to the east, an impressive distance for the single-shot rifles most tribes possessed at that time. Hammond's response was textbook cavalry doctrine. He immediately ordered his men to wheel toward the threat, forming a skirmish line while maintaining movement. The worst thing cavalry could do was remain stationary and present easy targets. They needed to close the distance, bring their firepower to bear, and force the enemy to either engage in close combat or retreat. But the Kiowa weren't where the shot had originated. As the cavalry line wheeled east, 3 more shots rang out from the west, dropping 2 more soldiers and wounding a third. The patrol was caught in a crossfire, the classic L-shaped ambush that military tacticians would later study in training manuals. Hammond tried to recover, splitting his remaining forces to address both threats, but the damage was done. The formation was broken. Chaos was setting in. Jonathan Mercer found himself separated from the main body during the confusion. His horse had spooked at the first volley, bolting northwest into a narrow ravine before Mercer could regain full control. By the time he managed to settle the animal, he was alone, the sounds of gunfire echoing strangely off the ravine walls, making it impossible to determine where his unit had gone. Military training dictated he should immediately attempt to rejoin his patrol. But Mercer's frontier instincts, honed during 3 years of survival in hostile territory, told him something different. The shooting had stopped. Complete silence had fallen over the landscape, broken only by the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. That silence was wrong. In his later testimony, given 6 weeks after the incident to a military inquiry board, Mercer would struggle to explain what he felt in that moment. Not fear, exactly. More like certainty. The absolute conviction that if he moved, if he made his presence known, he would die. It was, he told the board, like suddenly understanding you're being watched by a predator. The hair rising on your neck, the ancient part of your brain screaming warnings your conscious mind hasn't yet processed. He dismounted, moving with deliberate care to make no unnecessary sound. He led his horse deeper into the ravine, finding a spot where the walls narrowed and a cluster of large boulders provided cover. He tied the horse's reins to a twisted juniper growing from a crack in the rock, then positioned himself behind the largest boulder, rifle ready, watching the ravine entrance. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The silence continued, oppressive and unnatural. No birds, no insects, just the faint whisper of hot wind moving through the rocks. Then he heard them. Voices. Speaking in Kiowa, a language Mercer didn't understand but recognized from his years at the fort. The voices were close, perhaps 50 yards away, on the far side of the ravine wall. They seemed to be discussing something, though Mercer couldn't determine what. The tone was methodical, almost casual, not the heated exchanges of men still engaged in combat. One voice rose above the others, giving what sounded like instructions. Then silence again. Mercer's horse shifted nervously, the saddle creaking. In the stillness, it sounded like a cannon shot. The voices stopped instantly. Mercer felt his heartbeat accelerate, pounding so hard he was certain it could be heard beyond the rocks. His hands tightened on his rifle, finger moving to the trigger. He controlled his breathing, slowing it deliberately, fighting the urge to gulp air. 3 years of frontier service had taught him that panic killed faster than bullets. 30 seconds passed. A minute. The voices didn't resume. Instead, he heard movement. The soft scrape of leather on stone. The faint clink of metal. Someone was climbing into the ravine, working their way toward his position with careful, deliberate steps. Not rushing. Not making unnecessary noise. Professional movement from someone who understood stalking. Mercer made his decision. He carefully lowered himself to the ground behind the boulder, moving with excruciating slowness to avoid any sound of disturbed gravel. He positioned his rifle at his side, easily accessible but not in firing position. Then he removed his hat, setting it beside him. He loosened his collar, and he forced his body completely still. He was going to play dead. It was a desperate gamble based on frontier logic. If they found him already dead, they might search his body for valuables and move on. If they found him alive and armed, they would certainly kill him in a prolonged and extremely unpleasant manner. The tribes in this region had learned to hate the cavalry soldiers with an intensity that transcended simple warfare. Too many broken treaties, too many burned villages, too many murdered women and children. The captured soldiers rarely died quickly. Mercer closed his eyes to slits, just enough to maintain a narrow field of vision while appearing lifeless. He relaxed every muscle he could consciously control, letting his jaw go slack, his arms lie at awkward angles. He focused on his breathing, slowing it to the bare minimum needed to sustain consciousness. One breath every 45 seconds. In through the nose, barely perceptible. Out through slightly parted lips, controlled and silent. The footsteps grew closer. Through his slitted eyes, Mercer watched as a figure appeared at the ravine entrance. The warrior was perhaps 30 years old, wearing a mixture of traditional buckskin and acquired military equipment. A cavalry jacket, probably taken from a dead soldier, worn over native leggings. He carried a Winchester rifle, also undoubtedly captured. His face was painted with yellow and black stripes, the war markings Mercer had seen in intelligence briefings at the fort. The warrior stood motionless for nearly a full minute, scanning the ravine with practiced eyes. He looked directly at Mercer's position 3 separate times. Each time, Mercer fought the overwhelming urge to blink, to swallow, to adjust his position. He became stone. He became death already arrived. The warrior called out something in Kiowa. A question, perhaps, or a statement. No response came from beyond the ravine. He called out again, louder this time. Still nothing. Then he began walking toward Mercer's position. The next 16 hours would test the absolute limits of human endurance, willpower, and the primal instinct for survival. What Jonathan Mercer experienced in that ravine would never be fully recorded in official military documents. The Army didn't know how to classify it. How do you write a report about a man who defeated his enemies not through violence, but through an almost supernatural ability to cease existing? The warrior reached Mercer's horse first. The animal nickered nervously, pulling against its reins. The warrior examined it carefully, running his hands over the saddle, checking the saddlebags. He removed a leather pouch containing hardtack and jerky, pocketing it. He took the canteen. Then he did something that made Mercer's blood freeze, despite his desperate attempt at immobility. He cut the horse's throat. The animal made a horrible gurgling sound as it collapsed, blood spraying across the rocks. The warrior did it casually, without emotion, the same way a farmer might slaughter livestock. It was practical. A loose horse might alert other soldiers to the area. This way, no witnesses, no evidence that could lead pursuit back to this location. As the horse's death throes subsided, the warrior turned his attention to the boulders where Mercer lay. He approached slowly, rifle ready, eyes scanning for any sign of threat. He moved around the largest boulder, and then he was standing directly over Mercer, looking down at what appeared to be a corpse. Mercer stared at nothing through his barely open eyes, seeing the warrior's moccasins just inches from his face. He could smell the man, leather and smoke and sweat. He could hear his breathing, the faint creak of his rifle stock as he shifted his grip. The warrior nudged Mercer's leg with his foot, hard enough to move a living person, but Mercer had anticipated this. He'd deliberately positioned himself at a slight angle on sloped ground, so that the nudge would cause his body to roll slightly, naturally, like a corpse disturbed by external force. His arm flopped lifelessly, his head lolled to the side. The warrior grunted, seemingly satisfied. He knelt down beside Mercer and began searching his body. This was the moment where Mercer's performance had to be absolutely perfect. The warrior's hands moved over his clothing, checking pockets, removing his ammunition pouch, taking his knife. The hands were rough, impersonal, treating Mercer like an object rather than a person, which was exactly right. The dead don't merit gentle handling. But when the warrior's hand moved to Mercer's chest, feeling for the soldier's watch chain, he paused. Mercer knew why. The warrior could feel his heartbeat, faint but present. The question was whether he would notice, whether the slow, controlled rhythm would register as something other than his own pulse transmitted through his fingertips. Mercer remained absolutely still, not breathing, not moving, not existing. 10 seconds passed. 15. The warrior's hand remained on Mercer's chest, pressing slightly harder now, feeling more carefully. Mercer's lungs began to burn. He needed air. The urge to breathe was becoming overwhelming. A physical imperative his body was screaming at him to obey. 20 seconds. 25. The warrior removed his hand. He'd found the watch, a cheap brass piece Mercer's father had given him when he enlisted. The warrior examined it briefly, then pocketed it along with the other items he'd collected. Mercer allowed himself the tiniest possible intake of breath through his nose. Not enough to move his chest visibly, just enough to stave off unconsciousness. The warrior stood, looked down at Mercer one more time, then turned and walked back toward the ravine entrance. He called out in Kiowa again, and this time voices answered from beyond the walls. A conversation followed, too distant for Mercer to hear clearly, even if he'd understood the language. Then silence returned, complete and total. Mercer waited. 5 minutes. 10. 15. He didn't move, didn't risk even turning his head to check if the warrior had truly gone. The oldest trick in warfare was to make your enemy think you'd left, then wait for them to reveal themselves. The sun climbed higher. The temperature in the ravine rose past 110 degrees. Mercer lay on the rocks, feeling the heat radiating up through his uniform, baking him from below while the sun scorched him from above. Sweat began to soak his clothing, trickling down his face, into his eyes. He couldn't wipe it away, couldn't move at all. An hour passed, then 2. The first vulture appeared around 3 in the afternoon. It circled lazily overhead, gradually descending in the thermal updrafts, drawn by the smell of the dead horse and what it presumed was a dead human. It landed on a boulder 20 feet from Mercer's position, cocking its head to study the scene with cold, intelligent eyes. Mercer had seen enough death on the frontier to know how vultures worked. They were patient. They would wait to ensure their meal was truly dead before approaching. A wounded animal might still be dangerous. Better to watch, to wait, to let nature take its inevitable course. The vulture hopped closer, then closer still. It landed on Mercer's boot. Every instinct Mercer possessed screamed at him to kick, to move, to drive the carrion bird away. But he couldn't. If anyone was still watching, if the Kiowa scouts were observing from beyond the ravine to see if their apparently dead soldier was truly deceased, any movement would be instantly fatal. So Jonathan Mercer lay still while a vulture walked up his leg, its talons scraping against his canvas trousers, its weight shifting as it examined this potential food source. The vulture reached Mercer's chest and paused there, turning its head from side to side with those ancient, reptilian movements that made the bird seem less like a living creature and more like a mechanical thing, a wind-up automaton designed solely to locate and consume death. Its beak came within inches of Mercer's face. He could smell it now, the acrid stench of decay that clung to the bird's feathers, the reek of carrion and sun-baked flesh. The vulture opened its beak and made a low, rattling sound deep in its throat. Then it pecked at Mercer's collar. The sensation was surreal, a sharp pressure against the fabric near his neck, testing, probing. The vulture was checking to see if this meat was ready for consumption, if it was soft enough, decayed enough, accessible enough. Mercer's mind raced through the horrifying implications. If the bird decided he was edible, it would begin with the softest tissues, the eyes, the lips, the tongue, and he would have to lie there and endure it, because any reaction would bring death of a far worse kind than what this scavenger could inflict. But the vulture, in its own alien way, remained unconvinced. Living flesh was different from dead flesh in ways beyond temperature and movement. There was a quality to it, a tension, a subtle resistance that carrion lacked. The bird cocked its head again, studying Mercer's face with what almost seemed like confusion. Then it hopped off his chest, walked a few feet away, and returned to watching, waiting. 3 more vultures arrived over the next hour, drawn by the presence of the first and the overwhelming smell of the dead horse. They formed a loose circle around the ravine, perched on rocks and branches, patient as only scavengers can be. Occasionally, one would hop closer to Mercer, examine him briefly, then retreat. They were in no hurry. The dead would still be dead in an hour, in 2 hours, in 10 hours. Time meant nothing to creatures whose entire existence revolved around waiting for life to end. The sun continued its arc across the sky. 4 o'clock became 5 o'clock. The temperature remained brutally high, and Mercer could feel dehydration setting in despite his minimal movement. His mouth was completely dry, his tongue thick and swollen. The sweat that had soaked his uniform earlier had largely evaporated, leaving him with a sticky, salt-encrusted feeling beneath the heavy wool. His head throbbed with the beginning of what he knew would become a massive headache if he survived long enough to experience its full development. But worse than the physical discomfort was the uncertainty. Were the Kiowa still nearby? Had they truly left? Or were they watching from concealed positions, waiting to see if the corpse in the ravine would betray signs of life? Military intelligence reports suggested that some tribal scouts had been known to watch bodies for hours, even days, having learned through bitter experience that soldiers sometimes feign death to escape immediate execution. The question was whether these particular warriors possessed that level of patience and suspicion. Mercer had no way of knowing. All he could do was continue his macabre performance, playing dead while the sun slowly murdered him from above, and vultures circled like judges at a trial where the verdict was already decided. Around 5:30, he heard voices again. They were distant this time, coming from somewhere north of the ravine, beyond his limited field of vision. He couldn't make out words, could barely determine the language, but the tone was clear enough. Men talking casually, without urgency or alarm. The conversation lasted perhaps 2 minutes, then faded away into silence. Had the Kiowa returned? Were they setting up camp nearby? Or were these different warriors passing through the area on some unrelated mission? Mercer had no way to know, and the not knowing was in some ways worse than any physical torture. He was trapped in a prison of forced stillness, unable to gather information, unable to act, unable to do anything except lie there and hope that his desperate gamble would pay off. 6 o'clock arrived. Then 7. The sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the brutal afternoon heat finally giving way to something marginally more tolerable. The vultures became more active as evening approached, sensing that their moment might be coming soon. 2 of them landed near the dead horse and began to feed, tearing at the flesh with their powerful beaks, pulling out long strips of muscle and intestine. The sounds were horrific. Wet, tearing sounds punctuated by the vultures' guttural vocalizations as they fought over choice pieces. Mercer watched through his slitted eyes, forcing himself to remain calm, to not react to the grotesque display happening just yards away. He knew that if he survived this, if he somehow made it back to Fort Richardson, those sounds would haunt his dreams for years. The memory of lying helpless while scavengers feasted on flesh, knowing that he could easily become their next meal if he made a single mistake. 8 o'clock. The sky began to darken, the first stars appearing in the east. The temperature dropped rapidly now, the desert's typical dramatic shift from scorching day to frigid night. Mercer had been lying motionless for over 7 hours. His muscles were locked in position, cramping and screaming for movement. His bladder was painfully full. His thirst had progressed beyond discomfort into genuine danger. Dehydration could kill as surely as any bullet, and he'd had no water since the patrol's brief stop at Lost Creek that morning, nearly 10 hours ago. But he still didn't move. As darkness fell, the vultures reluctantly departed, flying off to wherever they spent their nights. Scavengers were largely diurnal creatures, doing their grim work in daylight when they could see clearly. With their departure, a new set of sounds emerged, the night sounds of the Texas frontier. Coyotes yipping in the distance, the flutter of bats hunting insects, the rustle of nocturnal rodents beginning their nightly foraging, and somewhere, not far away, the sound of a fire crackling. Mercer's stomach twisted. Someone had made camp within earshot of his position. The Kiowa, almost certainly. They hadn't left the area after all. They were settled in for the night, probably celebrating their successful ambush of the cavalry patrol. Mercer wondered briefly about the rest of his unit. How many had survived? Had Lieutenant Hammond managed to extract the patrol? Or had the entire unit been wiped out? Were there other soldiers hiding somewhere in the darkness, playing their own desperate games of survival? He would learn later that of the 23 men in the patrol, only 11 had made it back to Fort Richardson. 12 had died in the initial ambush and subsequent fighting. Lieutenant Hammond had been among the dead, shot through the throat while attempting to rally his scattered forces. The survivors had retreated south in disarray, leaving their dead behind, too badly mauled to attempt recovery of bodies. The Army would list Jonathan Mercer as killed in action, his body unrecovered, just another casualty of the endless frontier wars that were slowly grinding toward their brutal conclusion. But Jonathan Mercer was not dead. Not yet. 9 o'clock became 10 o'clock. The fire sounds continued, occasionally punctuated by voices and laughter. The Kiowa were in good spirits, understandably so. They'd achieved a significant victory against a cavalry unit, inflicting heavy casualties while suffering minimal losses of their own. It was the kind of success that would be remembered and retold around tribal fires for years to come. Mercer lay in the darkness, listening to the celebration of men who thought they'd killed him. His situation was becoming critical. The night cold was setting in hard now, temperatures plummeting toward freezing. His uniform, still damp with dried sweat, provided minimal insulation. Hypothermia was a very real possibility if he remained motionless all night. But if he moved, if he tried to generate warmth through activity, or attempted to crawl away from his position, he risked alerting the warriors camped nearby. Around 11 o'clock, he heard footsteps approaching the ravine again. Someone was walking toward his position, moving carefully in the darkness. Mercer couldn't see anything. The ravine bottom was pitch black, but he could hear the scrape of leather on stone, the faint sound of breathing. The person stopped somewhere near the ravine entrance, standing there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. Then a voice called out, in English, "Private Mercer, we know you still live. Come out. We will make it quick." The words were heavily accented but clear enough. Someone in the Kiowa war party spoke English, probably learned from missionaries or through interaction with traders and soldiers over the years. The statement was almost certainly a bluff, a psychological tactic designed to flush out any survivors who might be hiding in the area. If they truly knew Mercer was alive, they would simply come in and finish him rather than calling out announcements in the dark. Mercer didn't move, didn't breathe, became stone again. The voice called out twice more, each time with slight variations. "We have water. You are thirsty. Come out and drink. Your friends are dead. There is no shame in surrender." Each statement was designed to appeal to different aspects of desperation and fear, to find whatever psychological lever might cause a hiding soldier to reveal himself. Mercer remained silent. After the third call, the footsteps retreated. Mercer heard the person returning to the camp, heard a brief conversation in Kiowa, heard something that might have been laughter. They were testing the darkness, probing for survivors, but they hadn't actually confirmed his presence. If they had, they would have brought torches, would have searched systematically, would have found him. Midnight arrived. Then 1 in the morning. Mercer's condition was deteriorating rapidly now. The cold had progressed from uncomfortable to dangerous. He could no longer feel his fingers or toes. His teeth wanted desperately to chatter, and it took every ounce of willpower to keep his jaw locked shut, to prevent the involuntary shivering that would certainly give him away if anyone was still watching. The dehydration was affecting his thinking, making it hard to focus, hard to maintain the absolute mental discipline required for his survival. He began to hallucinate around 2 in the morning. His father appeared, standing over him, asking why he'd left the farm, why he'd abandoned the family to chase adventure in the God-forsaken territories. His mother was there too, crying, begging him to come home. His younger sister appeared, the one who'd died of scarlet fever when Mercer was 15, and she smiled at him with that gap-toothed grin he remembered from childhood. Mercer knew these weren't real, knew it was his brain beginning to shut down from dehydration and hypothermia and stress. But the visions were so vivid, so tangible, that he found himself wanting to respond, wanting to explain himself to these ghosts of memory and trauma. He didn't. He held onto reality by his fingernails, forcing himself to focus on physical sensations, the pain in his cramped muscles, the sharp rocks pressing into his back, the overwhelming thirst that felt like sandpaper coating his throat. These were real. These proved he was still alive, still fighting, still locked in this bizarre test of endurance against enemies who thought they'd already won. 3 in the morning. The fire sounds had died away. The camp had gone quiet, presumably with the warriors sleeping. This would be the logical time to attempt escape, when his enemies were least alert, when darkness would provide maximum cover. But Mercer still didn't move. Something held him in place, beyond simple caution. An instinct that told him this was still a test, still a trap, that someone was awake and watching. He would later learn his instinct had been correct. Kiowa tactics often included posting guards specifically to watch for the kind of nighttime escape attempt that seemed so logical to soldiers trained in conventional warfare. They understood human psychology, understood that a trapped man would wait until the darkest hours to make his move. By remaining motionless, even when logic screamed at him to flee, Mercer unknowingly avoided the trap that would have certainly killed him. 4 in the morning. False dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, that pre-sunrise glow that was somehow worse than full darkness. It provided just enough light to see shapes and shadows, but not enough detail to identify threats clearly. Mercer's hallucinations had faded, replaced by a kind of numb acceptance. He might die here. Probably would die here. If not from violence, then from exposure and dehydration. His body had been pushed far beyond normal human limits, but he still didn't move. 5 in the morning. True dawn arrived, the sun breaking over the horizon, flooding the ravine with harsh morning light. Mercer heard activity from the camp, voices, the sounds of breaking camp, gear being packed, horses being prepared. The Kiowa were leaving. But were they really? Or was this another test, another attempt to flush out survivors by creating the illusion of departure while warriors remained hidden, watching for movement? Mercer waited. He heard horses moving away, heading north and east based on the sound. The noises faded gradually, taking perhaps 15 minutes to disappear completely. Then silence returned, complete and absolute. Still Mercer didn't move. He'd come this far. 16 hours of playing dead, of enduring heat and cold and thirst and vultures and psychological torture. He wasn't going to ruin it by moving too soon, by assuming safety when the threat might still be present. 6 in the morning. The sun climbed higher, bringing with it the promise of another scorching day. 7 in the morning. 8 in the morning. The vultures returned, landing near the ravine, eyeing both the dead horse and Mercer with that patient, anticipatory stillness. Finally, at 8:37 in the morning, Jonathan Mercer moved. It wasn't a conscious decision so much as a physical necessity. His body had reached the absolute limit of what it could endure. He either moved now or he would die. Not from violence, but from the accumulated effects of exposure and dehydration. His choice was move and possibly be killed, or remain still and certainly die. He moved. The first attempt nearly failed. His muscles, locked in position for over 16 hours, simply refused to respond. His legs felt like wood, numb and useless. His arms trembled uncontrollably. It took several minutes of agonizing effort just to shift from his back to his side, and the movement sent screaming pain through every muscle fiber as blood flow returned to compressed tissue. No shots rang out. No warriors appeared. The Kiowa had truly gone. Mercer lay on his side for another 10 minutes, slowly working, feeling back into his extremities, forcing his body to remember how to move. When he finally managed to sit up, the world spun violently. Severe dehydration and orthostatic hypotension combined to make even simple movements nearly impossible. He vomited, though nothing came up except burning bile. His vision grayed at the edges, but he was alive. It took him another 30 minutes to achieve a standing position, leaning heavily on the boulder that had been his shelter and his prison. His legs threatened to buckle with every step. His canteen was gone, taken by the warrior who'd searched his body the previous day, but he still had his rifle. They'd left it, apparently considering it worthless compared to the repeating Winchester the warrior already carried. Mercer looked around the ravine with clear eyes for the first time in over 16 hours. The dead horse was a horrific sight in full daylight, partially consumed by vultures, bloated and stinking in the morning heat. The rocks where he'd lain were stained with his sweat, showing the exact outline of his body like a chalk mark at a crime scene. He needed water. Without it, he would be dead within hours. Fort Richardson was approximately 25 miles southwest, an impossible distance in his current condition. But Lost Creek, where the patrol had stopped the previous day, was only about 3 miles south. If any water remained in the stream bed, if he could reach it before complete collapse, he might survive. He began walking. Each step was agony. Each breath felt like inhaling broken glass. The sun hammered down with renewed viciousness, and within an hour his uniform was soaked through with sweat again, further depleting his dangerously low fluid reserves. He fell 3 times before reaching the creek. Each time, it took longer to stand back up, longer to force his body to continue moving. His mind began to wander again, disconnecting from reality, retreating into memories and fantasies as a defense against the overwhelming physical distress. But he kept moving. He reached Lost Creek at 11:43 in the morning, almost exactly 25 hours after the ambush had begun. The stream bed was there, baked clay and scattered stones, and in the deepest part of the channel, a small pool of brackish water remained, perhaps 6 inches deep, and scummed over with algae. Mercer collapsed beside it and drank. The water was warm, foul-tasting, probably contaminated with animal waste, and who knew what else? He didn't care. He drank until his stomach cramped, forced himself to stop, waited 10 minutes, then drank again. The water was life itself, regardless of its quality. He lay beside the creek for the rest of that day, too weak to continue, drinking small amounts every hour, letting his body slowly recover from the brutal ordeal. As evening approached, he forced himself to resume moving. Fort Richardson was still over 20 miles away, but if he traveled at night when temperatures were manageable, if he rested during the day, he might make it. It took him 3 more days. He walked mostly at night, navigating by stars and terrain features half-remembered from patrol routes. He found water twice more, small seeps that kept him alive. He ate nothing, having no way to hunt or forage and no strength to try. His body consumed itself, burning muscle tissue for energy, leaving him gaunt and skeletal. On the afternoon of September 23rd, 4 days after the ambush, a patrol from Fort Richardson spotted him. He was approximately 6 miles from the fort, walking in a straight line with the mechanical persistence of someone no longer fully conscious, operating on pure instinct and willpower alone. The soldiers almost shot him. He looked nothing like the Private Mercer they remembered. His uniform was in tatters. His face was burned nearly black by the sun, covered in sores and peeling skin. His eyes were sunken deep in their sockets, rimmed with red from burst blood vessels. He'd lost approximately 30 pounds. When they called out to him, he didn't respond, just kept walking, one foot in front of the other, heading southwest toward the fort he could no longer actually see. Lieutenant Samuel Morrison, who led that patrol, would later write in his report that he initially thought they'd encountered a ghost, something that had died on the plains and refused to accept it, continuing to walk through pure, stubborn refusal to acknowledge death. They brought him in. The fort surgeon, Dr. Augustus Pemberton, spent the first hour simply trying to get fluids into Mercer without causing his body to go into shock. The soldier was in a state of extreme physiological crisis, severe dehydration, malnutrition, second-degree burns over much of his exposed skin, muscle damage from prolonged immobility, kidney function compromised, multiple lacerations and contusions, mild frostbite on his extremities from that night of freezing temperatures. But he was alive. Mercer spent 2 weeks in the fort hospital before he was coherent enough to give a full report. When he finally told his story, describing the 16 hours of playing dead, the warrior who'd searched his body, the vultures, the voices in English trying to lure him out, the officers who interviewed him reacted with something between admiration and disbelief. The Military Inquiry Board initially questioned whether his account could be accurate. 16 hours of absolute immobility seemed beyond human capability, but the physical evidence supported his testimony, the specific pattern of his injuries, the location where he was found, the timeline of his movement back to the fort. Most convincingly, a follow-up patrol sent to the ambush site found the dead horse in the ravine, exactly where Mercer described it, along with other details that matched his story perfectly. The board ultimately concluded that Private First Class Jonathan Thaddeus Mercer had indeed survived through an extraordinary combination of frontier skills, iron will, and sheer luck. They commended his actions and recommended him for promotion. But the story doesn't end there. It never really ends. 3 weeks after Mercer returned to active duty, a trader came to Fort Richardson bringing news from the Kiowa territories. He'd been trading with a band camped along the Red River, and in the course of business, one of the warriors had shown him something unusual, a brass pocket watch with an inscription inside, JTM, with love from Father. Jonathan Thaddeus Mercer's watch, the one taken from his body when the warrior searched him in the ravine. The trader said the warrior had told an interesting story about the watch. He'd taken it from a soldier who appeared to be dead after an ambush. But later, other warriors in his band had reported seeing a lone soldier walking near Lost Creek. Walking like a dead man, they said. Moving, but not alive. When the warrior went back to the ravine to check, the body was gone. Only the dead horse remained. The Kiowa believed they'd killed Mercer, but that his spirit refused to rest, that he'd become one of the walking dead that appeared in their traditional stories, a ghost soldier who continued fighting even after death. The warrior kept the watch as protection against the ghost, a talisman to ward off the angry spirit. When Mercer heard this story, he said nothing. He never asked for the watch back, never tried to contact the trader or arrange for its return. He seemed content to let the Kiowa believe their version of events. Let them think he was a ghost, if they wanted. Maybe it would make them think twice before ambushing another patrol. But those who knew Mercer well noticed changes after his ordeal. He became more solitary, spending hours alone, often sitting perfectly still in the fort chapel or out on the walls at night. Other soldiers reported that he sometimes didn't seem to blink for minutes at a time, that he could sit through entire meals without moving, without eating, just staring at nothing. He served out his enlistment and mustered out in 1876. The Army offered him a chance to re-enlist with his promotion and commendations, but he declined. He returned to Pennsylvania, to what remained of his family farm. Neighbors later reported that he became increasingly reclusive. He would spend entire days sitting motionless on his porch, watching the road, seeming to wait for something that never came. In 1883, 10 years after the ambush, Jonathan Mercer disappeared. His farmhouse was found empty, no signs of struggle, no indication of where he'd gone. His bed was neatly made, dishes were washed and put away, a fire was laid in the hearth, but not lit. Everything suggested he'd simply walked out one day and never returned. Some speculated he'd gone back west, back to the territories where his defining moment had occurred. Others thought he'd simply wandered off into the wilderness, seeking solitude, or perhaps seeking death. The Pennsylvania authorities investigated briefly, but found nothing. Jonathan Mercer was listed as a missing person, and eventually the case went cold. But here's what they found in his house that nobody could explain. In his bedroom, carefully preserved in a wooden box, was a collection of items that made no sense. Vulture feathers, 24 of them, arranged in careful rows. Rocks from the Texas plains, specifically red clay stones of the type found around Lost Creek, and a piece of canvas cut from what appeared to be a cavalry uniform, stained with sweat in the exact outline of a man's body. He'd kept souvenirs, mementos of the day he died and came back. And there was something else, a journal, mostly empty, but with one entry dated September 19th, 1883, exactly 10 years to the day after the ambush. The entry contained only 4 sentences, written in Mercer's careful script. I have been dead for 10 years. Every day since the ravine has been borrowed time. The vultures know the truth. They are still waiting. The journal was never fully explained. The authorities treated it as evidence of mental disturbance, possibly explaining his disappearance. But those who study the darker corners of frontier history sometimes wonder if there was more to it. If something happened to Jonathan Mercer in that ravine that went beyond simple survival. If lying motionless for 16 hours, while your body cooled, and vultures circled, and enemies celebrated your death, changed something fundamental about a person's relationship with life itself. There are reports, unconfirmed but persistent, of sightings over the years that followed. A man matching Mercer's description seen in various locations across the Western Territories. Always alone, always still, standing beside trails or sitting on rocks in remote areas, perfectly motionless, watching travelers pass. When approached, he would vanish, not running away, just gone, as if he'd never been there at all. The Kiowa band that had ambushed the patrol was eventually forced onto a reservation in 1875. Before they were relocated, there were stories told around their fires about the ghost soldier, The one who couldn't die because he was already dead. The one who'd learned to stop his heart, to stop breathing, to become death itself. They said that if you traveled alone in certain parts of North Texas, especially near Lost Creek, you might see him, sitting among the rocks, covered in vultures, watching with dead eyes that somehow still saw everything. The last confirmed sighting was in 1903, 30 years after the ambush. A surveying team working near what had been Fort Richardson reported encountering an elderly man in the remnants of a cavalry uniform sitting beside a ravine. They approached to offer assistance, thinking him lost or injured. As they got closer, they realized he wasn't breathing, wasn't blinking, but his eyes tracked their movement. One of the surveyors, a man named Robert Callahan, who'd served briefly in the Army, later wrote in his diary that the man's uniform had a name stenciled inside the collar, J.T. Mercer. But the uniform dated from the 1870s, and the man wearing it should have been in his 50s if he was the original owner. This man looked far older, ancient almost, dried out and preserved, like something that had been dead for a very long time but refused to acknowledge it. When they tried to speak to him, he simply stood up and walked into the ravine. They followed, concerned for his safety, but when they reached the bottom, he was gone. No tracks, no sign he'd ever been there, just rocks and dead brush, and the distant cry of vultures circling overhead. The question that haunts researchers who've studied this case is simple but unsettling. Did Jonathan Mercer survive that day in the ravine? Or did he die there, and something else, something that had learned too well how to mimic death, walked out in his place? The military records are clear. Private First Class Jonathan Mercer returned to Fort Richardson on September 23, 1873. He served honorably until his discharge. He received commendations for his actions, but the man who came back was not quite the man who'd ridden out that morning. The soldiers who knew him before and after all agreed on that point. Something had changed, something fundamental. Maybe he'd simply been traumatized, suffering from what we'd now recognize as severe PTSD. Maybe the ordeal had broken something in his psyche that could never be fully repaired. Or maybe, just maybe, when you learn to become death so completely that even vultures and enemies are convinced, you can never fully come back to life. In certain fundamentalist churches across Texas and Oklahoma, there's a tradition that's been passed down for generations. When warning young people about the dangers of pride, of thinking you can control forces beyond human understanding, preachers sometimes tell a story. They don't always use Mercer's name. Sometimes he's anonymous, just another soldier. But the details remain consistent. A man who learned to stop his heart, who became so still that death itself passed him by, who walked away from his own grave and spent the rest of his existence trapped between living and dying, belonging fully to neither state. And the moral is always the same. Be careful what you become in order to survive, because you might be too successful. You might survive so completely that you can never truly live again. Is it true? Did Jonathan Mercer really disappear in 1883? Did those surveyors really see him 20 years after that disappearance? Are there still sightings in remote areas of Texas of a motionless figure in antique military dress, watched over by circling vultures? The documented parts are undeniable. The ambush happened. Mercer survived through extraordinary means. He returned to Fort Richardson after being listed as dead. His subsequent life was marked by increasingly strange behavior. His disappearance is a matter of public record. But the rest? The ghost sightings? The man in the ravine who wasn't breathing but wasn't dead? Those details exist in the murky space between folklore and fact. Impossible to prove, but equally impossible to entirely dismiss. If you ever find yourself traveling through North Texas, near the area where Fort Richardson once stood, pay attention to the rocks and ravines. If you see vultures circling, but not descending, if you notice a stillness that seems unnatural, if you catch a glimpse of something motionless among the stones, don't approach, don't investigate, because some survivors carry their survival too far, learn their lessons too well, and become something that's neither alive nor dead, but trapped forever in between. The ravine where Mercer lay for 16 hours is still there, though it has no marker, no historical sign to commemorate what happened. The rocks remain. The ravine walls stand unchanged by time, and sometimes locals say, if you're quiet enough, if you hold your breath and listen, you can still hear it. The sound of a man not breathing. The sound of a heart that learned to beat so slowly it might as well have stopped. The sound of death being played so convincingly that death itself was fooled. Jonathan Thaddeus Mercer survived September 19, 1873. The records prove it. But maybe survival isn't the same as living. Maybe when you cross certain lines, when you become death to escape death, you can never fully return to the world of the living. Maybe you're marked forever, claimed by the space between heartbeats, trapped in the eternal stillness you used to save yourself. The Kiowa were right about one thing. The ghost soldier walks. He's still out there, among the rocks and ravines, perfectly still, perfectly patient, playing dead so convincingly that he forgot how to be alive. And if you listen to those who claim to have seen him, they all report the same disturbing detail. He's always covered in dust and dried sweat, in the exact pattern and shape of a man lying on his back, as if he's been in that position so long that the earth itself has marked him, as if he never really stood up from that ravine floor at all. Some soldiers survive by fighting. Some survive by running. Jonathan Mercer survived by becoming indistinguishable from death. And in doing so, he may have learned the most terrible lesson the frontier had to teach, that the line between the living and the dead is thinner than we think, and easier to cross than we'd like to believe. As you go about your life, remember this story. Remember that survival sometimes demands we become things we were never meant to be. And remember to hold onto your humanity, even in the darkest moments, because letting go might save your life, but cost you something far more precious. Turn to God. Turn to Jesus Christ. In your darkest hour, when you feel like death is the only escape, remember that there is always another way, that surrendering your soul to darkness, even to survive, is never worth the price. Jonathan Mercer may have saved his body that day in the ravine, but many believe he lost something infinitely more valuable in the process. Pray. Seek the light. Don't let the darkness teach you its tricks, because darkness is a teacher that never truly releases its students. The vultures are still circling. They've been circling for over 150 years, and somewhere among the rocks and ravines of North Texas, something that was once a man named Jonathan Mercer continues its eternal wait, having learned too well how to play dead to ever remember how to live.